This morning we're going to be talking about analytic-based performance management with one of our experts, Gary Cokins. Gary has tons of background that he'll tell you about in a minute, but I'm excited about this topic because it's different. It's different than some of the other topics we've done, and I think this whole area of performance management, especially enterprise performance management, is one that needs a lot more discussion. So Gary, thank you for being on today.
Pleasure to be here.
And Gary, so let's start by talking about a little bit about your background. And you've written a number of books. You've clearly been in this industry for, I think, nearly 40 years. I think a background about why and how you got into this industry is really applicable here.
Well, my career has basically been in what I would say 3/3. My first decade was in industry with a large Fortune 100 conglomerate. I was actually a division controller, financial controller in Milwaukee. My middle 15 years was in consulting, Deloitte, KPMG, and then EDS, which got acquired by HP. And then up to 3 years ago when I retired, I'm 67, my grandsons are 13 and 17, but I was with SAS for 16 years, the large analytics software vendor. My undergraduate is industrial engineering and operations research from Cornell. You can say I'm an old guy, 71, and I did my MBA at Northwestern University's Kellogg. You notice that there's 4 book covers there that you're showing, and the last one's Predictive Business Analytics. We may talk about that a little bit during our session. But I think careers have a lot more to do with luck and circumstances than being smart and competent. And I had a lucky break in 1988 with KPMG. They had a contract with Professor Robert S. Kaplan of the Harvard Business School. Many recognize his name from Balanced Scorecard work. And they recruited several of us. And when he did the early pioneering work in activity-based costing, I implemented it for 5 years and I wrote a book. And that led to writing more books, and my career shifted from really going up the hierarchy of the organization chart to really educating and inspiring, quite frankly, business development for the software sales force. So that's pretty much a little summary of my career.
That's awesome. So given you're a thought leader, I think the place to start this conversation is describing what is enterprise performance management and how is it different from some of these other disciplines?
Well, there's a lot of confusion and lack of consensus about enterprise performance management, even just performance management. If you Google performance management, all the hits will basically be on the human resources, personnel, employee appraisals. The issue there, you really have to put the adjective enterprise or corporate performance management, and they're synonymous. The good news is this: enterprise performance management is not a new thing that employees and managers have to learn, but rather it's the integration of existing methods that people are already familiar with. KPIs, profitability reporting, planning, budgeting, we'll talk about some of those. The problem is most organizations have been implementing these methods in isolation of each other. They'll have one planning team in one part of the building and the budgeting people in another building and the profitability in another building. And you get a whole lot more synergy when you integrate these like gears in a machine, these various methods. So enterprise performance management, its acronym EPM, is not really a process or a single method. It's really the integration of many methods. And they've been around for decades, arguably even before computers.
So that's interesting. So you're talking about the fact that you have all of these methods around EPM and CPM. So what's the interest now in these? And is it the same? Is it changing now as it relates, especially as we integrate analytics into that?
Oh, the interest in EPM, is definitely increasing, and it will continue to increase. Very few people even knew the term 10 years ago, and then Gartner or some of the IT analysts began to advocate it. This is going to take 4 or 5 minutes. I want to share with you what I think are the forces or pressures that cause interest in people in EPM. First is just strategy execution. Executives are frustrated with failure to execute their strategy. They're good at formulating strategy. That's not the issue. They're bright, or they can bring in high-level, powerful consulting firms. Their frustration is failure to execute. the strategy. There's a fair amount of evidence. Challenger, Gray and Christmas, an executive recruiting firm in Chicago, monitors the involuntary turnover of CEOs, and it's setting all-time records. Carly Fiorini at HP being an example. And that's where the balance strategy map balance scorecard comes in. That's about strategy execution. We may talk about that later. A second one is just increased accountability. Today, there's no place to hide. You know, employees will be measured. They will be monitored. It doesn't necessarily mean their job's at risk, but it could certainly adversely affect their salary increases or promotability. Another force is just rapid decision making. Unlike 3 or 4 years ago when you could test and learn and have meetings in conference rooms with your supervisors, today people be on the phone and it's go or no go, yes or no. And you know, they would almost like to say, gee, I wish the executive team was sitting next to me. What decision would they make? Is it consistent and aligned with their strategy? You know, a fourth one is really poor cost accounting. Most of the managers do not trust the accounting system. You know, and we're not talking about the financial external reporting. We're talking about the internal. All these cost allocations seem to be unfair. We may talk about the solution to that, activity-based costing, later. Another force, and I think this is an important one, is I think customers increasingly view suppliers as commodities. And therefore, for suppliers to compete, they really need to provide differentiated services to different micro segments of customers. And not all of them are doing that well. And the CFO doesn't really contribute much because they don't even provide any of the, if you will, profit and contribution margin information below the product gross profit margin line. So there's got to be a much better understanding about not just growing sales, but growing profitable sales. And that's one of the issues. The marketing and sales team tends to be measured by 2 things: grow market share and grow sales. It's got to be grow profitable sales. Another one is the budget. Holy mackerel. I think there's so many jokes about the budget that probably the best thing to do with the budget is abandon budgeting altogether. I mean, it takes many months to produce the thing, and then it's obsolete in a couple of months after it's published. It caves into the loudest voice and strongest muscle of kind of the, you know, veteran sandbaggers who know how to put it together. So, but that raises the question, well, if we stop budgeting, what was the purpose of a budget in the first place, and what do we replace it with? And if there's time, we can talk about really replacing it with what we would call capacity-sensitive, driver-based rolling financial forecasts. Another pressure is supply chain. I think the issue there is most customers view their suppliers as the enemy. This has got to stop. You know, we've got supply chains that are competing against other supply chains for share of wallet and share of purse. And so trading partners in the supply chain need to be collaborative and work with each other and identify mutually beneficial project opportunities that'll save both of them costs. And then the last one is, I think, really questionable return on investment from large software implementations like ERP systems or CRM systems. And I think if you ask many chief information officers 2-3 years after a long implementation of a large ERP system, you know, how well did the return on investment meet or exceed the ROI that the salesperson said it would 3 years ago? And I think most CIOs would say, I don't think so. We put in a lot of work and effort, and now we got the thing running. That does not mean you shouldn't have implemented that ERP or CRM system. Absolutely, you have to. You need the platform, you need the information. The problem is the ROI is latent. It's buried in all of that transactional data, that mountains of data that's created. And what the enterprise performance management methods does is it converts that data into information for insights and foresight and decision making, and that's where the ROI eventually will come from. So EPM will create the ROI. So that was a whole laundry list. To answer your question, what's caused interest in EPM? Most of the things I think mentioned are really issues with most organizations.
So much of what you said, in fact, all of what you said really resonates for somebody who also has been in the industry a few years. But kind of how do these methods, how do these forces that exist within these enterprises, you know, how do we use analytics to help us in these areas?
Well, each of the methods on a standalone basis is pretty powerful. Let's just talk a little bit about the methods, and then we'll talk about embedding analytics into a method. Let's start with the strategy map and the balanced scorecard. I'm a big advocate. Now, many organizations allegedly claim they have a balanced scorecard. The Kaplan and Norton wrote the books 10 years ago. Very few of them actually have a strategy map. This may surprise some people, but I think the strategy map is 10 to 20 times more important than the balanced scorecard. The scorecard is just a feedback mechanism. The real intelligence, the GPS, if you will, is in the strategy map. And there's not enough time in this interview to look at what's a strategy map, but people can Google it and get an idea of what it is. It's a great diagram that communicates the strategy of the executives to employees in a way that they can understand it. And then it also becomes kind of a foundation for all of the strategic objectives in the map, because they're all linked from learning and growth, the process, to customer, to financial. They can identify the key performance indicators that'll monitor it. And we'll come back to that in a second. When it comes to costing, in the many organizations, activity-based costing is the proven method, especially for organizations that have repetitive tasks. I mean, in many ways, the accountants are still back in the 1960s. They haven't adopted some of the progressive methods, but what ABC is all about, the simple way to understand ABC is, imagine you go to a restaurant with 3 other friends. You order a little salad, the other 3 order the most expensive item on the menu and a glass of wine. And at the end of the meal, the waiter or waitress comes and gives the bill, and the other 3 say, hey, let's split this check evenly. How do you feel? Not fair. Well, that's how products and standard service lines feel in the accounting system when the accountants take this big, large amount of overhead and peanut butter spread it, based on these broad-based averages, labor input hours, number of units produced, sales dollars. None of those reflect the unique consumption that the products and services and customers consumed of those resources and the work activities and business processes. So what activity-based costing is like is as if the waiter or waitress brings 4 individual checks. It's a tracing mechanism. It's not about, it's modeling. Costing is modeling. It's not T accounts and journal entries. And then I guess one more is the rolling financial forecast. Once you have good unit cost information, calibrated unit cost from the history, in industrial engineering, I think first semester at Cornell, it was volume and mix times unit level rate equals capacity required. And that's the way you can basically, if you have the integration, you've got the cost, you've got the forecast, the volume and mix, you can basically continuously calculate rolling financial forecast every quarter, every month, and basically get some insight. Same information can be used for what-if decisions. Now, your question was, what about analytics? Well, let's just take a couple examples. And analytics is still in an embryonic stage of embedding them into some of the methods, but they add more power. So let's go back to the strategy map. If you saw a strategy map, I probably should have put a diagram. It basically has these objectives and the arrows of the KPIs to the next objective. So you have these cause and effect relationship, learning and growth. If the employees are accomplishing those things, training, they'll contribute to process improvement. If they're accomplishing the process improvement, they'll contribute to customer satisfaction, loyalty. If you're accomplishing that, it'll basically contribute to the financial. Well, people basically kind of wing it when they start selecting the KPIs, or they use a lot of measures that they have been measuring. And I'm like, wait, is that what you can measure? What you should measure? How do you know those reflect the strategic intent of the executive team? Well, just imagine if you had 24 months of KPI data. You could do correlation analysis. And in the map, where the map are typically in PowerPoints with a single arrow, you hit the correlation, you could see thick arrows and thin arrows. The thick arrows would say there is a heavy relationship between if I'm improving this objective, it's contributing to that objective. But if it's a thin arrow, it means, well, wait a second. We're basically moving better here, but we're having no impact. So we can start, if you will, validating the quality of the KPIs. And you could have negative KPIs, which means if this department's doing too good, they're adversely affecting another one. All of a sudden, a PowerPoint becomes a scientific laboratory, just like in genetics or astrology. So that's one example of using analytics in one of the methods, and all the other methods have examples too.
So, but as we're having this discussion, I'm sitting here going, okay, so this is really cool. All of these methods independently have lots of value. What do you do? How do you tie them together? Because unless they're tied together, there's not really going to be an enterprise view of this, or is there?
Well, I think any of the software vendors will basically like that question because, you know, the software tools are pretty good. The issue is seamless integration. So, I mean, I'm not going to name particular vendors, but I mean, for example, let's say you refresh your KPIs in your strategy map, and one of those KPIs, for example, might be customer profitability, all the way below the product gross profit margin line. And let's say, and this is a very embryonic approach, that you start changing the commission structure for the sales force from not 100% exclusively sales, but let's say 60% sales and 40% profit by customer. So that when the sales director is having their account planning with the sales force, it's like, well, how are you going to get that customer to be more profitable? Don't just sell them more and be discounting. Well, if I can refresh my KPIs over here, or my cost accounting system that calculates the customer profit, I can immediately export it to the KPI system and the commission structure. That's just one of the links between these various tools. I already mentioned if you have unit level consumption rates, what's the cost per blood test in a hospital? What's the cost of a shipment to a close customer or far one? I can use those unit rates when I forecast volume and mix to basically forecast capacity. So now this is really capacity requirements planning. So it's the integration is really brings the power, and by spicing it with analytics, regression, correlation, clustering, segmentation, association, all of the great analytic tool, they become even more powerful.
So that's cool. So, but is there any also, I guess the real question is how do these methods fit together? And is there a way to integrate them?
Well, I have a diagram, if you want to bring it up, that basically is sort of my picture of EPM. Now, many of the IT research firms, they have their own view of EPM, but you know, they're all IT diagrams with databases and so forth. So the way I look at it is, this is circulatory. Think of this like your blood system. And before I ask you to click the next thing, what we want to connect is the customer. See that customer satisfaction box? We want to connect the shareholders at the bottom right, because here's the point. Customers are the source of value creation for shareholders. That's why we really want to start with customers. Okay. So once we know, I have a lot more insights and understanding about customers, and I'm talking about, and there's so many powerful tools in the marketing space, then now click the arrow once, and then the executive team, now the executive team can formulate the strategy. And yes, they can use the Michael Porter 5 forces and all of the other fancy stuff, but in the end, strategy formulation is going to be based on, if you will, serving customers. Then they can communicate, one more click, they can communicate the strategy to the employees in a way that they can understand it, using a strategy map and identifying the various KPIs. You know, the KPIs are really measures. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't improve it. It's the old, you know, if you get what you measure. Once employees every day are looking, if you will, on their dashboards or scorecards, click it one more time, now that's going into the organizations. That's where all the employees, all the assets are. Imagine if every employee every day could answer this one question. How am I doing on what is important? How am I doing on what is important? Well, if you've got these three arrows going, they can go in the morning, look on their screen, is the dial favorable or unfavorable to the target? And if they're all doing that, then it's not how am I doing on what's important, how are we doing as an organization on what we're doing, on what's important. So that's the strategy execution piece. Click it one more time. Now comes that customer view. See, the real issue that companies really have to answer is, what types of customers are attractive to retain, to grow, to win back, to acquire? Which types of customers are not? And how much should we optimally spend with our discounts and our deals and so forth? And so this is the whole area of really getting return on investment, really return on customer, ROC, really understanding the financial return from customers. So click the arrow next. Now comes what most everybody's familiar with, processes. And if those of the older people remember the Michael Hammer era business process reengineering, everybody said, tilt the organization 90 degrees, focus on the, work backwards with the end in mind, customers, not the organizational chart and all of its, self-serving behavior. And the ERP vendors started to come out, and then these consultants started to have these end-to-end process diagrams. And order fulfillment is really the dominant and most universal process. Take the order, complete the order. And that's what you're sort of seeing in this diagram, that little circle, better, faster, cheaper. So click there one more time. So the point really is this. People ask, what's the roadmap for the complete vision of enterprise performance management? And I say there is no roadmap. What there is there's an origin and a destination. We start with customer, we end with the shareholders, okay? What the priorities should be really is up to the executive team. They've got to figure out, because if you start imagining that those arrows, those veins in that thing are like your bloodstream, arteriosclerosis, any one of them that's constrained is going to constrain the shareholder wealth creation. So if people don't understand the strategy, you should do strategy maps. If they don't understand profitability, you should do ABC. But in the end, they should all be done quickly. And I want to emphasize quickly, I'm a big advocate of rapid prototyping. Some of the viewers may be saying, well, what Gary's saying makes sense, but I've heard about that ABC. I think it takes a year. It's got 3,000 activities. Nonsense. Those are all led to problems in the 1990s. People overbuilt and overdesigned the models way beyond diminishing returns and extra accuracy. The best technique is rapid prototyping. In the IT world, it's called RAD, Rapid Application Development. And this is one service that I do provide. It's a 2-day exercise. You build that model so quickly, not for the purpose of useful information, but to accelerate the learning and getting buy-in and saying, oh, wow, it's not that difficult. And if you do 2 or 3 iterations, within 2 to 3 weeks, you've got a permanent repeatable production system. It doesn't have to be perfect. For financial accounting, yeah, you get the numbers wrong, you go to jail. For management accounting, you get the numbers wrong, you don't go to jail. It's got to be roughly correct, and it's better than what anybody's ever had.
Boy, that sounds like a great approach, this whole idea of rapid prototyping. And we talk about it a lot, but it seems like we just don't want to do it. So I suspect you have some examples, without naming company names, of companies that have done that and have found great results fairly quickly.
I've done it with them. I mean, I actually learned the lesson. It was serendipity, because I was doing it the old way, the big, interview everybody in their office, get this long list of activities. That took a week or two, then find drivers, then bring in IT. There was an event that happened to me where an executive said, can I see what this thing's going to look like? And I said, well, if you give me 5 or 6 people in the room, I'll try to build it fast. That's the first model. The 2 days is just 5 or 6 people. The iterations, then basically you take your time, you go a little bit quicker. I call it 18 holes of golf on a polo horse. Boom, now I know what it's done. Second round, we'll take our time. You can do rapid prototyping with the strategy map as well. You can get the executives in the room. You can use yellow posted SWOT analysis. Remember, the first model is not meant for use. It's basically to get buy-in and, oh, that's how it's done, and then you take your time a little more slowly. The problem, though, is you mentioned a lot of the accountants, they think in such detail that they basically trip over their own shoelaces, if you will.
Well, you've mentioned, actually have written quite extensively at times about kind of the slow adoption of this, which is kind of hard to understand at some level. So there must be some barriers that are really slowing people down.
I'm so frustrated that slow adoption rate, especially with the CFO community. I mean, they're back in the 1960s. For starters, the technology is not the barrier. The technology is not the impediment. The software tools are proven, they work. Here's the reality. The problem is people. We'll get to that in a second. Yes, some of the barriers are IT related, dirty data, disparate data sources. I got IBM, I got Dell, I got HP equipment in here, but the IT communities learned how to solve all that, and they use extraction, transform, and load ETL to clean up the data. So that's one of the barriers. A second barrier, I sort of alluded to, is this perception that to implement these methods really takes a long time and it's complex. and will take forever and in a questionable value. And that's what the rapid prototyping does. It really moves so fast that all the naysayers basically, are taken care of. The real barrier is people. And one of them is just resistance to change. And it's human nature. I mean, people like the status quo. Another issue is fear of being accountable, fear of being measured. Another barrier is fear of other departments or other people knowing the truth. Oh, if they really knew that I'm a sales manager, and this is the biggest customer, they must be the most profitable, and they discover it's not the most profitable. That person doesn't want anybody to know that. So, that's an issue. Weak leadership. There, I said it, I put it on the table. If the executive team doesn't get it, they don't really have the leadership skills, that's going to be a problem. And let me just make another comment about leaders. I think in the past, the best leaders had the best answers. Today, I don't think that's the case. I think today the best leaders have the best questions. There's way too much complexity and volatility for them to basically rely on their gut feel or intuition or so-called sixth sense or the types of decisions they made in the past that got them promoted to the high levels that they're at. I think executives today have to create a culture for investigation and discovery, and this is where analytics fits in. This is why business analytics and all of its various flavors are going to become critical, because only through insights and foresights will organizations really, if you know the book, Competing on Analytics, be able to successfully compete. And those executives also need to have tolerance for errors, as long as you basically learn from the mistakes that you make.
It's interesting. You just stumbled onto something that I didn't know you were going to say, but it's kind of at the heart of why my partner and I started Business Analytics-Collaborative, because we kind of felt like, to your point, there's a lot of people should be asking lots of questions and giving them a forum by which they can come in and interact with individuals, interact with folks like yourself, experts in the area, and be able to collaborate with their teams to kind of come up with what I think might be the right answers, because this complexity thing is unbelievable. And I don't know that we're facing complexity the way we should. I still think we're kind of believing that we have the ability to solve these problems by ourselves. But that's an opinion. What do you think?
Oh, well, I think this raises this whole issue. What's the difference between business intelligence and business analytics? And I'm glad that you've named it the Business Analytics-Collaborative. Now, now we're into semantics, and a lot of people say, oh, BI is the big umbrella, but I really think business analytics is a step above BI. I think basically BI will surface information and it'll give you maybe reporting information, but I think what analytics does is it allows you to ask questions, and better questions, and more complex questions, and then more importantly, it has the ability to answer the questions if you basically do the deep dive and use the advanced analytics. So I'm in complete agreement with you that analytics is really just going to be essential.
Well, and I think the other thing that we've had a couple sessions on, which I think is great, and this fits right into it, which is we in this industry though get so fixated on the technology. And so many times it's the things beyond the technology. It's thinking about how these processes and methods should work together and how they should be integrated. It's those things that really make the analytics or the things we're visualizing, the information we're getting, really powerful.
Oh, no, I agree. And I recall, in the past, the real power analysts, the PhDs, they would always do hypothesis and test, their hypothesis and so forth, and see whether the control group whether it worked out. But and I'm not that technical, but this whole in-memory chip computer stuff is really making you the ability to basically almost do a test in a few seconds instead of waiting a day, to test 10 million customers and so forth. So, and you don't have to be a data scientist, I don't think, anymore. I think it's really now the casual user increasingly is going to basically acquire the skills. There's training courses and so forth, to apply analytics. So, I graduated in '71 with an operations research degree, and make a long story short, my first couple of years, I had a job where, no one was interested in OR, no one was interested in optimization, and people didn't get it, I wish I was 25 years old and graduating with an OR degree today, because now the computing power is there. The margin for error is thinner for companies to be competitive. Executives at the top kind of like get it. So, you know, we're at the golden age now, the beginning of the golden age of analytics.
That's an awesome way to put it. So this has been a great topic, and I think we've kind of covered a lot of territory. Any other kind of summary points that you would love to kind of leave our audience with?
Well, just briefly, I want to return back to this frustration. It's taking too long, and I think that what's going to be required by managers and people who are listening is you got to get better at behavioral change management. And the problem is, if I see all the attendees, raise your hand, how many have degrees in sociology and psychology? It'd be none. You know, you're all Newtonians. You know, the world's a big machine. Just give me the powers, levers, pulleys, dials, and so forth. We've got to be Darwinian. We need to start learning, how do you basically overcome resistance to change? Just pay attention that this basically, it's really almost social engineering. How you get buy-in is going to be increasingly important, because a lot of people may be nodding their head, yes, I like that. And in their own mind, they're going, no, I'm not doing that.
Well, that's a great bit of wisdom to leave us with. I'm going to ask if there's any questions, and as I'm teeing that up, one of the things I want to also tell our members who are watching this today or watch it in the future is Gary is an expert on Business Analytics Collaborative in our expert section. And in his portal, you can learn a lot more about things he's writing on. You can see his blog and other things that he is writing to kind of talk about this topic in kind of more richness and in some other vectors. So feel free to go and visit Business Analytics Collaborative and check out Gary's portal. Ryan, do we have any questions from the audience?
We do, Rich. We have one today that I'll read. And before I throw that at you, Gary, I will say again, just to remind everybody, at the top of your window is that Q&A button. So here in the next 5 minutes, if you think of a question or you want to pose a question to Gary, go ahead and submit that via that button. And then again, I'll remind us all again that if you think of a question tomorrow, or like Rich said, if you're watching this on the replay at some point in the future, feel free to head to Gary's discussion forum via the Gary Cokins expert page on BAC, and you can submit your question there, and Gary will be responding to those as they come in, and the conversation can continue there. So having said that, the question from today, let me just read this, Gary, for you. Who in the organization is typically driving the analytics-based EPM implementation, or the push? And so I'll add kind of some color there. You know, is it accounting? Is it management? Since the analytics capability may live within a specific analytics group, is it analytics groups that's driving this, as you've seen? And then maybe one add-on to that is, who's doing it versus who should be doing it, or what have you seen that's been successful as companies try to implement this?
Well, you know, you refer to me as an expert. I am not an expert. I don't think there's experts in any fields anymore. There's just too many interdependencies between time and cost and quality and service level. So I don't know the answer to the question of like which department. Is definitely not finance and accounting. I can tell you that. Most usually in commercial companies, it's the marketing group. But I think where the drive really comes from is not about the organization chart, but it's about what I would call champion behavior. And in my observation, that when I see the executives tend to be too preoccupied with firefighting and short-term priorities, and it's often managers 2, 3, 4 levels down from the C-suite that basically kind of have a passion and fire, and they'll do a prototype or a proof of concept or a pilot project, and they'll prove or demonstrate to their colleagues. So my answer is, I don't think it depends on what department or functional area. I think it's about individual, you know, champion behavior. Briefly, when it comes to how to basically move it ahead, there's a debate whether they should have centers of excellence with, you know, a couple of PhDs, and, you know, like the doctors in and the departments come in and say, oh, I want to try this fancy thing. The alternative, the polar opposite, is basically start out by selecting a small problem that you can apply analytics to. kind of work backwards with the end in mind, and start small, think big, and have some success with that simple project where, oh, we got some insights because we used regression or correlation, and then let the jungle drums beat in the newsletter in the company, and people start picking up, oh, we're starting to use analytics. That is, I think, I advocate that way to go. So
great. Thanks, Gary. That's an empowering answer, I think, for a lot of people. Rich, nothing else at this time, so I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you, Gary, for being here again today. And I'll argue with you about this point about you being an expert, but we'll take that up on another day in another session. But thank you for being here, and thank you for enlightening our audience around kind of how to blend analytics or analytics kind of based performance management, corporate performance management. So thank you for being here. And again, if anybody has any follow-ups, feel free to ask those within BAC on Gary's forum page. Thank you.
thank you.
All right. Again, thanks to Gary and thanks, Rich, for hosting today. We're going to officially end the webinar here now. You can watch this on replay at BACollaborative.com, or you can join the conversation there. We look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.